My hand trembling, blindly reached for my pocket, and I pulled out a small folding knife I always carried. With the last of my strength, I lunged and drove the blade into its twisted face. The knife sliced through its flesh, but instead of blood, a thick, foul-smelling black substance poured out, instantly burning my hand. The creature let out a piercing, unnatural shriek and released its grip on my throat. My name's Jonathan Crawford, and I've spent my entire life in a small town in Oregon. My life's been pretty ordinary: school, college, and a string of dead-end jobs that didn't bring much satisfaction or money. When I lost my last job, hope for a better future started slipping away. The constant search for new openings led nowhere, and I was running out of cash for rent and bills. That's when I stumbled upon a job ad for a night watchman position at Greenhall Cemetery. The place looked run down, the kind of spot no one visits during the day, let alone at night. The ad was brief: night watchman needed. Good pay. Night shifts, quiet setting. Main duty, maintain order. It was the kind of simple job offer I couldn't turn down, so I decided to give it a shot. My new boss, Michael Graves, was a gloomy guy with a bit of an odd vibe. He didn't say much about the cemetery, and during our brief meeting, he kept his distance, almost like he didn't care much for the place himself. When I first met him in his old creaky office near the cemetery gates, he handed me a set of keys and a small envelope with handwritten rules inside. "Follow these, and you'll be fine," he said, barely making eye contact as he was already heading for the door. "What are the rules?" I asked, trying to understand why he seemed so secretive about them. He paused abruptly, glanced back like he was debating something, and added, "They're not a joke. The cemetery, it's different. You'll see." His words left me feeling uneasy, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I tore open the envelope, expecting to find routine instructions like lock the gates or make rounds every 2 hours. But what I found left me unsettled. 1. Never walk down the central path after sunset. 2. If you see someone in white, leave immediately. 3. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. 4. Never open the gates if someone knocks after midnight. 5. Always double-check the gates are locked when you leave. The rules felt absurd, almost like a joke, but something told me not to take them lightly. Michael seemed dead serious when he mentioned them. I figured it was just part of the job, maybe some weird local superstition or an inside joke among the staff. Stepping through the gates of Greenhall Cemetery, for the first time, a heavy silence fell around me. Rows of gravestones stretched out in every direction, and the darkness was already creeping in. The cemetery looked ancient, forgotten. Moss-covered tombstones, some so worn you could barely make out the names. The first night went by pretty uneventfully. I made several rounds, trying to get used to the stillness and emptiness. Massive trees loomed over the graves, their shadows stretching out, making it seem like something was always moving just at the edge of my vision. By day, this cemetery probably just looked neglected, but at night, it transformed into something entirely different. The air itself felt thicker, heavier. I tried to stick to the rules, even though they seemed ridiculous. My shift started with a check of the gates. I locked them up and began my patrol. I avoided the central path, not because I believed in anything supernatural, but because I figured I shouldn't tempt fate on my first few nights. Everything was fine for the first few hours, but as midnight approached, things started to change. The silence was interrupted by faint, almost imperceptible sounds, like someone or something was moving nearby. At first, I tried to explain everything away. It's probably just animals, I told myself. But that uneasy feeling kept growing. The footsteps behind me got louder. They were slow, barely noticeable, but inching closer every time I stopped. I remembered the third rule. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. It sounded stupid. Who wouldn't turn around if they heard something behind them? But I held back. With every minute, the silence seemed to grow louder, if that makes any sense. I felt like I could hear my own breathing, and my heart was pounding so hard it could burst from my chest any second. Then, the footsteps came again, closer this time. I instinctively tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself to keep moving forward, ignoring whatever was happening behind me. Suddenly, my flashlight started flickering, and that almost broke me. I stopped, scanning the darkness around me. Just ahead, deeper into the cemetery, something was moving between the graves. At first, I thought it was some animal, maybe a fox or a coyote. But the figure was too tall and distinctly human-shaped. Then I remembered the second rule. If you see someone in white, leave immediately. My blood turned cold when I saw it. It was a figure, dressed in filthy white, moving among the graves. Its arms were outstretched, and its head was tilted downward, as if searching for something. I tried to force myself to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. My body felt frozen in place, as if it had already become part of the eerie scene. Something about this figure was wrong. It moved too smoothly, like a ghost, and its white clothing looked like it had turned to dust long ago. And then, I heard the knock. From the direction of the gate, where I had just been, came a dull, rhythmic sound. Someone was knocking at the gate. My heart started pounding wildly as I recalled the fourth rule. Never open the gate if someone knocks after midnight. The knocking was steady, calm, and unrelenting, getting louder with each passing moment. I stood there, in the middle of the cemetery, caught between the figure in white and the knocking at the gate. Whatever it was starting to fill the space around me with a dark, oppressive presence. It felt like the knocking was echoing inside my head, drowning out everything else. I froze, unsure of where to go, toward the gate or away from the figure in white. But by now I knew, whichever choice I made would be the wrong one. Absolute terror gripped me, and I began to realize these rules weren't just some senseless guidelines. Something sinister and unnerving controlled everything that happened here. Every cell in my body screamed danger, but I was paralyzed by fear. The knocking at the gate grew louder, and the figure in white was getting closer. Its movements were bizarre, as if it wasn't walking but gliding just above the ground, barely touching it. Its arms, long and thin, hung lifelessly, but they radiated a cold that pierced straight to my bones. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. Glancing around, I realized I was trapped. The figure was almost upon me, and something about its stare filled me with dread. Its eyes, like dark, empty voids, seemed to carry something more than just death. It was beyond anything I could comprehend. I looked back at the gate where the knocking continued. I knew I couldn't open it. That was the fourth rule, and there was no ignoring it now. But staying here, waiting for this creature, that felt like certain doom. I took a few steps backward, trying to distance myself from the figure, but my body refused to cooperate. The fear was so deep, so overwhelming, that every move I made felt sluggish, like I was moving underwater. Suddenly, the figure in white jerked violently. Its body twisted at an unnatural angle, its spine cracking with a sickening snap, and it collapsed to the ground, reaching out toward me with its long arms. Its face was contorted, its jaw twisted, black liquid dripping from its mouth, and its eyes locked onto mine, as if pulling my soul into the abyss. I screamed and started to run, even though I knew it was pointless. The thing slithered across the ground like a snake, leaving a dark, oily trail behind. It was inches away from me when I tripped, my legs tangling beneath me. For a moment, everything went black. But when I lifted my head, I saw something even worse. The ground around me began to shift. The graves, silent and still until now, suddenly split open, and from them erupted hands, pale, deformed, rotting. Bodies started to rise from the earth, their faces covered in dried, dark blood, their eyes hollow and empty, staring directly at me. They reached for me, their bony fingers clawing at my clothes, my legs, my arms. I struggled desperately, trying to pull free from their dead grasp. But with every second, more of them appeared. One of the corpses grabbed my leg, dragging me down. My hands slid through the damp soil, searching for anything to hold on to, but it was no use. Blood dripped from my torn shoulder and the darkness around me thickened, wrapping itself around me like cold fingers. The figure in white was crawling closer. I could see its face now, no longer remotely human. It was twisted into a grotesque grimace, and its mouth, unnaturally wide, was ready to swallow me whole. Thick, tar-like fluid dripped from it, eating away at the ground beneath. Its hands wrapped around my throat, and I felt the air being squeezed from my lungs. Everything around me began to fade into a fog. Each second stretched into eternity. I felt the dead hands pulling me deeper into the earth, the darkness consuming me completely. And then, in that final moment, when it seemed like my body would tear apart, I remembered the last rule. If you see someone in white, leave immediately. But now it was too late. The figure in white tightened its grip around my throat, its fingers as cold as ice, claws digging deep into my skin. I could hear my own bones cracking under the pressure, and blood slowly trickled down my neck, mixing with the dirt beneath me. My vision was starting to blur, but the instinct to survive pushed me to fight back. Blindly, I swung at its face, feeling my fingers connect with a slick, decayed mass that felt more like rotten flesh than anything human. Its head tilted slightly, but it didn't slow down. I gasped for breath, struggling to break free, and for a brief moment I managed to pry one hand off my throat. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. From the graves that had split open around me, other creatures were rising. Their bodies covered in half-rotted skin hanging in shreds from their bones, and their mouths twisted into grotesque, terrifying smiles. Their eyes, dark and hollow, gleamed under the faint moonlight breaking through the thick clouds. One of them grabbed my leg. Its fingers were long and bony, its nails scraping the skin from my calf, leaving bloody streaks. Another reached for my shoulder, and I could already feel its fingers digging into my flesh, tearing it apart. I fought desperately, but their strength was inhuman. The figure in white, still clutching my throat, leaned in closer, and I felt its breath. It reeked of decay, like the stench of death itself. Its mouth gaped open, and thick black liquid oozed out, dripping onto my chest, burning my skin like acid. I screamed in agony, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the darkness around me. It stared at me with its hollow eyes, and I could feel my life slipping away with each second under its gaze. My hand, trembling, blindly reached for my pocket, and I pulled out a small folding knife I always carried. With the last of my strength, I lunged and drove the blade into its twisted face. The knife sliced through its flesh, but instead of blood, a thick, foul-smelling black substance poured out, instantly burning my hand. The creature let out a piercing, unnatural shriek and released its grip on my throat. Gasping for air, I stumbled backward, but the dead bodies surrounding me still clawed at my limbs. One of them latched onto my arm, its sharp nails tearing through my skin, and I felt the hot rush of blood spill from the wound. My arm throbbed with pain, but I swung the knife again, aiming for its head. The blade struck, splitting its skull, and bits of rotten flesh splattered across my face. But for every corpse I took down, more rose up. They surrounded me, their bodies distorted, arms bending at impossible angles, but that didn't stop their relentless assault. The figure in white, despite the wound, slowly began to rise again. Its face was now shapeless, just a black void leaking the thick liquid, and it moved toward me again, its body defying all physical laws. I felt myself being dragged down, the dead pulling me into the earth. The ground beneath my feet had turned to sludge from the blood and decay, and I could feel my legs slowly sinking into the muck. I clawed at the ground, desperately trying to stay above, but it was futile. My fingers slipped in the wet dirt, and with every motion, more corpses grabbed hold, pulling me deeper into the darkness. Chaos filled the air around me. The creatures continued to drag me down, and the figure in white was closing in again. Its twisted body was drenched in that dark, corrosive liquid that dripped onto the earth, eating through it like acid. It reached out, and I felt its bony fingers graze my face, leaving a burning trail across my skin. In one final act of desperation, I gathered all my strength and lunged forward. I drove the knife into its arm, and it let out another inhuman scream. Its body convulsed, and its limbs began to fall apart, the black liquid spraying in all directions. Its face disappeared into the shadows, and its body slowly dissolved into nothingness. But the rest of them remained. The dead continued to rise, and the ground beneath me had given way completely. Blood poured from my wounds, mixing with the mud. The figure in white reached for me again, its distorted face inches away, while the dead hands around my legs gripped tighter, pulling me into the earth. It leaned closer to my face, and the stench of rotting flesh hit me, cutting through to my very core. In that moment, everything felt doomed. My strength was almost gone, and I couldn't feel my body anymore. Just burning pain and the terrifying cold seeping through my skin. The ground beneath me cracked. It felt like I was sinking not just into mud, but into some kind of void, a dark abyss waiting below. The figure in white let out a hideous, inhuman laugh that pierced my ears and shattered my mind. Its mouth opened wide, and thick black liquid poured out, dripping onto my face, burning my skin like acid. But something shifted. Time seemed to slow down. In that instant, just as its hands nearly touched my face, everything around me froze. The darkness itself seemed to halt in mid-motion. Its grotesque face hung suspended, just inches away. My breath came in shallow gasps, but there was nothing but dead silence all around. Suddenly, the ground beneath me completely gave way. Instead of being swallowed, it opened up, like a door. I fell. My vision blurred as my body plummeted into the void. A feeling of weightlessness overtook me, as though I was no longer part of this world. Falling deeper, all I could see was endless darkness around me. I couldn't tell if this was the end, or just the beginning of something worse. Then, everything changed. I found myself somewhere else. No graves, no corpses, no figure in white. I was standing on dry, solid ground in the middle of the cemetery. The air was still, completely silent. My body was covered in blood and dirt, but the graves were still again. They looked peaceful, just like when my shift first began. Confused, I scanned the area. There were no signs of a struggle, no trace of the horrors that had nearly killed me. It was as if I had just woken up from a nightmare. But the marks were still there. The cuts, the torn clothes. Proof that it had all been real. My legs gave out beneath me and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. My mind was blank. What had just happened? Was I dead or still alive? Why had they let me go? I glanced down at my hands, caked with blood and grime, and noticed something on my left palm. A mark, a dark stain that spread like ink. I felt it pulse, sending waves of pain through my body. It was as if something had left a part of itself in me, a reminder that I no longer fully belonged to myself. The cemetery gates were wide open. I didn't remember unlocking them, but now they stood ajar. Beyond the gates lay a quiet street, empty, no people, no cars. The air outside the cemetery seemed lighter, but I wasn't sure anymore if this was the real world. I forced myself to my feet and began walking toward the gates. Each step was painful, a struggle. When I reached the gates, something made me stop. I turned to look back, and what I saw froze me in place. Standing in the middle of the cemetery, among the graves, was Michael Graves, my boss. He stared at me, his face emotionless, his eyes hollow, like he was only a shadow of the man I'd met on my first day. He didn't move, just stood there, silently watching me. "You're alive," he said, but there was no sound to his voice. It existed only in my mind, like a thought that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. I turned away and bolted through the gates, not wanting to see that awful man again. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew that this night would haunt me forever. I don't know how I survived that night. I don't know what happened to those creatures, that place, or me. But one thing I understood clearly: those rules weren't just some strange set of prohibitions. They were the line between life and death, between reality and the horrors hidden in the shadows of this world. The mark on my palm faded a few days later, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Even now, as I write these words, I can feel the weight of what I saw and what I went through. I quit the job, left town, and never returned to that cemetery. But the sense that something is still following me hasn't gone away. Every night, when I lie down to sleep, I hear those same footsteps behind me. And now, I never turn around. But whenever I hear a faint knock at my door, I know it's a reminder. And I'll never open those gates again.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Together we can take this channel to the next level, and don't forget to check out this video.